Julia Roberts, the smile that once melted the whole world, America's sweetheart, the symbol of love, beauty, and Hollywood's dazzling light for more than 3 decades. But behind that smile was not happiness, only a collection of wounds delicately hidden beneath a layer of red lipstick. She once shocked the world by calling off her wedding right before the ceremony, quietly slipping into a small church in Indiana to marry in haste, only to have it fall apart in less than 2 years. Romantic love stories turned into ruins, vows turned to ashes under the glare of flashing cameras. At the height of fame and glory, Julia Roberts remained the loneliest woman in Hollywood, a fragile heart worn down by loss and fractured relationships. And now, at 57, the immortal icon of world cinema faces her most silent enemy, loneliness, the passing of loved ones, and scars that no time can erase. What has made the woman with the brightest smile in the world learn to live with the darkness? To understand why the woman who once made the world believe in fairy tales must now live with wounds that will never heal, we have to return to where it all began. Julia's childhood, where her first light flickered amid the shadows of a broken family. Julia Fiona Roberts was born on October 28, 1967, in the small town of Smyrna, Georgia, a place of cracked red dirt roads and old wooden houses creaking in the rain, just like lives struggling to stay upright in the storm. The Roberts family home was far from luxurious moldy walls, a leaky tin roof, winter winds seeping through wooden slats, forcing 3 children to huddle together on an old bed for warmth. Her parents, Walter and Betty Lou, were both actors-dreamers in the conservative American South. They bravely opened the first acting school in the area that welcomed both black and white children, an act so courageous it earned the admiration of Martin Luther King Jr. But their courage in the public eye could not save them from the storm inside their own home. Money was scarce, artistic dreams traded for piles of unpaid bills, and arguments often stretched till dawn. When Julia was just 4 years old, the marriage fell apart. Her father left, leaving behind a little girl with wide brown eyes staring into an empty, cold room. Later, her mother remarried Michael Mose, and the fragile home grew even darker. Shouting matches, slamming doors, muffled cries swallowed into pillows each night. Neighbors said the police had been called more than once. Julia, her brother Eric, and her sister Lisa learned to walk softly, speak softly, even breathe softly, as if one wrong sound could make everything explode. Little Julia also struggled with a stutter, every word caught in her throat, trembling with fear. At school, she was the quiet child, withdrawn, always sitting in the corner, avoiding eye contact. At home, silence was the only way to survive. Then when she was 10, tragedy struck. Her gentle father, the only safe harbor, she had died of throat cancer. He hid his illness and even his death to spare his daughter fear. Before passing, he left behind a few cassette tapes, recordings of bedtime stories he used to tell. In the nights that followed, Julia curled up under her blanket-pressed play and listened to his voice echo through the damp darkness. That warm, soothing voice now trapped in magnetic tape. She held the recorder as if it were his hand, replaying it over and over until the tape broke, as if by doing so, she could keep him with her a little longer. School did not save her from loneliness. Classmates mocked her radiant smile, calling her fangy. The smile that would later light up all of Hollywood once made her bow her head in shame. Yet in that darkness, a quiet flame began to burn. Acting became both her escape and her salvation. From broken speech exercises to small amateur performances, she learned to turn pain into emotion, silence into words. In 1985, she left Georgia with a few $100s and a small suitcase, stepping into the biting cold of New York City. The city did not welcome her. Her first apartment was a cramped room with a broken heater and cracked walls. At night, she slept in her coat. She survived on instant noodles, rationing meals to get through each day. Endless casting calls ended with cold rejections, more than 200 of them. And on snowy nights, Julia would trudge home, her breath turning to mist under the dim yellow streetlights. But she kept whispering her vow to herself, try again. Then one day, a fleeting smile in a Clarisil commercial earned her the first union card, the tiny ticket into the dream world she had longed for. No one knew that behind that smile lay a childhood full of scars, a heart once shattered, but one that never stopped beating. In 1987, on a cold, grey morning in Chicago, Julia Roberts stepped onto the set of Crime Story, her first ever television role, appearing in just one episode. She had a fever, her body trembling, yet she still put on makeup and walked in front of the camera. Sweat mixed with the heat of the studio lights and a small accident involving smoke effects left burns on her skin, real scars mirroring the invisible wounds she had carried since childhood. She didn't give up. Discipline was her armor, resilience was her weapon. Standing on the thin line between poverty and ambition, she chose survival. Her tiny New York apartment was empty. Only a few packets of noodles remained in the kitchen, and the cold seeped through every crack in the door. In her hand, she held her only treasure, her father's old watch. The metal had been polished bright by the grip of her hand. Every night she missed him, but hunger doesn't wait. With trembling fingers, she slid the watch across the pawnshop counter. As the clerk counted the money indifferently, her tears fell onto the face of the watch, blurring the time. Ela sentiu como se tivesse perdido o pai novamente. Anos mais tarde, quando já era uma estrela, Julia procurou e comprou de volta aquele relógio. Nunca o usou como joia, mas como uma cicatriz transformada em símbolo, uma lembrança de que tinha sobrevivido e de que nunca se tinha esquecido. In the year 1988, surgiu Mystic Pizza, um pequeno filme de baixo orçamento que se passa numa cidade costeira ventosa. Mas, desde o primeiro fotograma, Julia surgiu como uma chama. Roger Ebert descreveu-a como uma beleza com uma energia feroz, uma profecia para a lenda que estava para vir. Em 1989, em Flores de Aço, interpretou Shelby, uma jovem noiva com uma doença terminal, um papel delicado que exigia um apoio emocional extraordinário. Ela não era a primeira opção. No set de filmagens, houve dias em que chorou sozinha no camarim, insegura e subestimada. Mesmo assim, ela transformou essas lágrimas em combustível. Julia infundiu em Shelby cada memória de abandono, perda e desprezo, criando uma performance tão crua que todo o set ficou em silêncio. Com apenas 22 anos, ganhou um Globo de Ouro e recebeu a sua primeira nomeação para os Oscars. As feridas que quase a destruíram tornaram-se a própria matéria-prima da sua arte. Da fome, do frio e da rejeição, ela emergiu carregando algo que ninguém poderia extinguir: a chama da vida. Em 1990, um argumento chamado Pretty Woman, originalmente uma história sombria sem um final feliz, parecia condenado ao fracasso depois de a produtora ter falido. O projeto parecia enterrado. A Julia teve de fazer um novo teste. Richard Gere, o protagonista, continuava indeciso, até que Julia sorriu e lhe entregou um papel com apenas 3 palavras escritas. Por favor, diga que sim. Ele assentiu, e nesse instante, começou a história do cinema. Julia chegou ao set como uma rapariga desconhecida, usando sapatos baratos, mas quando as câmeras começaram a gravar, o mundo silenciou. Naquele deslumbrante vestido vermelho, com os olhos a brilhar e o sorriso que antes era motivo de chacota nos pátios das escolas, a iluminar milhões de corações, ela tornou-se inesquecível. Pretty Woman arrecadou centenas de milhões de dólares, transformando Julia Roberts na menina bonita da América. As mulheres imitaram o seu estilo, os casais voltaram a acreditar no amor. E Beverly Hills tornou-se um local de peregrinação. De um apartamento úmido em Nova York, ela entrou diretamente para a lenda, mas a fama, como qualquer chama, também arde. A pressão, a imprensa implacável e o flash constante das câmeras destruíram a sua vida amorosa. O seu noivado com Dylan McDermott evaporou-se como fumo. Mais tarde, ela confessaria: "O mundo inteiro ama-me, mas às vezes sinto que não pertenço a ninguém." Julia lançava-se em novos papéis como forma de fugir de si própria. Da dor, da solidão, dormir com o inimigo, uma sobrevivente de abusos. Morrer jovem, uma história de amor à sombra da doença. E o gancho de Spielberg, um mundo de magia que não conseguia curar o esgotamento nos bastidores. Cada papel deixou uma nova cicatriz, mas ela continuou. She understood that beauty was never a gift, it was a battle. And Julia Roberts fought for every smile, every tear, every frame that the world could never forget. By the late 1990s, Julia Roberts was no longer just the girl from Pretty Woman. She was the queen of romantic comedies, the icon adored by millions. My Best Friend's Wedding, 1997, shattered conventions, giving her a role both intelligent and vulnerable, calculating yet profoundly human. Audiences saw in her not just a star, but a real person, imperfect but sincere. Notting Hill, 1999, blurred the line between art and life, as Julia played a famous actress falling for an ordinary man. It wasn't just a role, it was a reflection of her own longing for peace amid the storm of fame. Runaway Bride reunited her with Richard Gere, rekindling the spark that once electrified the screen and turning them into Hollywood's golden couple. Those films weren't just successes, they became memories for an entire generation, making Julia's smile a universal language of love. Then came the year 2000, and with it, her defining role. Erin Brockovich, a single mother, ordinary yet unyielding in the face of power. Gone were the glamorous layers of makeup. Julia appeared raw, stubborn, fierce, and radiant. She became the first woman in Hollywood history to earn a $20 million salary. Once a young actress paid less than her male co-star in Pretty Woman, now she had turned the tables. The role brought her not only a Golden Globe, an Oscar, and $250 million in box office success, but also a victory for all women, proof that talent deserves its worth. When she stepped onto the stage to accept her Oscar, she smiled through tears and said, "I'm just a girl from Smyrna, Georgia, and I'm standing here." That sentence rang out like vindication, closing every doubt and opening the most glorious chapter of her career. By 2001, her films had grossed billions, making Julia Roberts one of the most powerful stars in cinematic history. But her true legacy wasn't in the numbers. It lay in the journey from a little girl trudging through snow in worn-out shoes, pawning her father's watch to survive, to a woman standing at the summit, rewriting Hollywood's rules. Julia Roberts was no longer just America's sweetheart. She had become a symbol of resilience, a living testament that the deepest wounds can shine into healing light. Her smile wasn't just beautiful, it was a scar turned to gold. Yet behind that smile, Julia's heart still wrestled to find peace. Her love life, like her roles, was always beautiful, but fragile. Broken engagements, fractured promises, and the cruel lesson that love beneath the spotlight of fame can fade even faster than it blooms. In the early years of her career, she found a brief moment of peace in Liam Neeson and the calm, gentle man who soothed the storm inside a young woman just emerging from poverty. Their love was short-lived, but intense, like a streak of light across the sky, leaving in her the realization that love could be both a shelter and a storm. That feeling seeped into every role she would later play, from the aching gaze of Shelby to the luminous smile of Vivian Ward. Then came Dylan McDermott, a love that seemed written by fate, arriving just as she stood at the threshold of glory. They got engaged quickly, reaching for stability amid the whirlwind of fame. But Hollywood does not tolerate peace. The paparazzi swarmed intimate dinners, and the news turned into screaming headlines, and the engagement ring became a symbol of loss. Within a year, the dream dissolved. Julia learned the bitter paradox to be adored by the whole world, yet never truly belonged to anyone. It was her first lesson, and not her last, that the love of America's most famous woman always came with a price. When the cameras stopped rolling and the lights went out, Julia returned to silence. Her heart still cracked, but the light in her eyes never dimmed. In the early 1990s, Julia Roberts' career soared like a kite catching the wind. Pretty Woman had made her America's muse. Her smile lit up billboards, magazine covers, and millions of hearts. To the world, it seemed she had everything: fame, beauty, money, and power. But behind the luxurious velvet curtain of Hollywood, her heart was quietly writing a different story. Not one about glamour, but about the fragile faith in love, the very thing she had longed for since she was a lost little girl in a leaking house in Georgia. At the center of that story was actor Kiefer Sutherland, charming, unpredictable, and irresistibly magnetic. Together, they became Hollywood's golden couple. Their laughter echoed on film sets, on red carpets and cozy dinners, meant for two. To the world, it looked like destiny. To Julia, it felt like her last hope for a real home. The wedding was planned down to the tiniest detail. Gold-embossed invitations, an ivory gown that shimmered white flowers filling the aisle, and a guest list so star-studded it made all of Hollywood pause. Newspapers reported on it daily, and fans counted down the hours to what was being called the wedding of the century. Yet, amidst the laughter, the photos, and the blessings, Julia grew quieter during her dress fittings. She smiled gently at her reflection, but her eyes seemed far away. To her, the wedding wasn't about proving love to the world. It was about finding peace, something her broken childhood had stolen. She told friends she would write her own vows, not for the cameras, not for the press, but for him and for her own heart. But as with every fairy tale under Hollywood's lights, the magic began to crack. As June 1991 approached, the whispers grew louder. Rumors of betrayal of Kiefer's secret affair were heard at nights out of two souls slowly drifting apart under the weight of fame. Both remained silent, but the noise around them became deafening. And then, just 3 days before the wedding, the world had been waiting for her. Julia did the unthinkable. She walked away. The shock rippled through Hollywood like an earthquake. The wedding dress still hung on its rack. The altar still glowed with flowers. But the bride was gone. White petals began to wilt. The wedding music never played, and joy turned to sorrow. The tabloids screamed, speculated, condemned. But in the middle of the chaos, Julia stayed silent. Alone in an empty room, she was no longer a star, no longer America's sweetheart, just a young woman sitting on the floor staring at the cold ring on the table, listening to her heartbeat echo in the heavy stillness. Later, Julia would say, leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was the only right thing. And Kiefer years later admitted that Julia had been braver than him, brave enough to walk away from something that no longer felt true. No blame, no bitterness, just two people who once loved each other, standing at the crossroads where love could no longer survive. The cancelled wedding was not an ending. It was a beginning of pain and of rebirth. From that upheaval, Julia stepped onto the screen with eyes that were utterly transformed, deeper, more truthful, carrying a wound the audience could feel even if they couldn't see it. in Sleeping with the Enemy. She embodied a woman escaping abuse, a trembling, hauntingly authentic performance that made the world believe she was reliving her own fears. In Dying Young, her gaze carried tenderness and loss as if every line had been written from memory. And so the unworn gown at the altar that never witnessed vows, the bells that never rang, all became legend. The world might remember that cancelled wedding as a scandal, but for Julia, it was the moment she found herself not in ruin, but in resilience, not in bitterness, but in grace. She had been wounded beneath the brightest lights, but she refused to let that define her. Julia Roberts, the woman who once stood beneath an arch of flowers, waiting for vows that would never be spoken, walked away carrying the scars of love and transforming them into art. She learned that strength does not come from what is complete, but from the courage to let go when your heart tells you it's time. And from that moment on, every role, every smile, every triumph she achieved carried within it the echo of that fateful day. The day Julia Roberts, beneath Hollywood's brightest lights, chose silence instead of saying I do. In 1993, an unexpected turning point left all of Hollywood stunned. Julia Roberts, a beleza da América, o símbolo de amor e força, afastou-se discretamente das câmeras, entrou numa pequena igreja no Indiana e trocou votos com o cantor country Lyle Lovett. Não houve casamento luxuoso, nem vestido cravejado de joias. Apenas ela com um vestido branco simples e ele com botas de cowboy. Foi um momento íntimo, fugaz e tão dolorosamente genuíno que poucos conseguiam acreditar que fosse real. A imprensa chamou-lhe uma tempestade de verão, um choque de Hollywood. Mas para Julia não foi uma representação. Era uma tentativa frágil, mas sincera, de encontrar um lugar a que pertencer. Naquele momento, não era a rainha dos cartazes de cinema. Era uma mulher ansiando por amor, por encontrar a paz, por se ancorar em algo real. O casamento foi discreto, mas de curta duração. Em menos de 2 anos, tudo terminou em silêncio. Sem acusações, sem ressentimentos. Julia e Lyle separaram-se com respeito mútuo. 2 artistas que entenderam que, por vezes, a maior coragem está em saber quando deixar ir. Para Julia, não foi um fracasso. Foi mais uma lição de que a perda nem sempre é um fim, mas por vezes o início de um novo capítulo na busca do coração pela verdade. Não houve filhos, nem um lar duradouro, apenas ela e a quietude que se seguiu. Mas, em vez de deixar que a solidão a consumisse, Julia optou por transformá-la. Ela transformou a dor numa espécie de armadura gentil, que a tornou mais profunda, mais sábia e ainda mais sedenta de amor verdadeiro. Para o mundo, era apenas mais uma manchete. Para ela, era a peregrinação de uma alma que ainda procurava o caminho para casa. Em meados da década de 1990, Julia Roberts já tinha vivido romances apaixonados que terminaram cedo demais. Um noivado desfeito e um casamento que se desfez como o vento. Ela continuava a ser a maior estrela do planeta, mas por detrás daquele sorriso deslumbrante, escondia-se um coração cansado. Certa vez, ela admitiu: tenho tudo, mas não tenho para onde voltar. E depois, como que por obra do destino, durante as filmagens de A Mexicana, em 2000, Julia conheceu Daniel Muta, um diretor de fotografia. Não uma celebridade, não um rosto num cartaz de um filme. Ele estava atrás da câmera, calmo, firme e humilde, um contraste impressionante com o caos glamouroso que a rodeava. Quando se conheceram, Daniel ainda estava casado, e a tempestade de rumores começou instantaneamente. As manchetes sensacionalistas dos tabloides gritavam especulações, que disparavam, mas Julia e Daniel permaneceram em silêncio. Não deram explicações nem desmentiram nada. Deixaram o tempo falar por eles. E o tempo provou a sua verdade no meio do ruído e do caos. Encontraram algo raro, a paz. Daniel não via nela uma estrela, mas sim um ser humano. Um ser humano. Amava Julia não pelo sorriso famoso, mas pela fragilidade que se escondia por detrás dele. A sua amizade cresceu silenciosamente, desabrochando lentamente em amor. 2 anos depois, a 4 de julho de 2002, Julia Roberts, a mulher que em tempos chocou o mundo ao cancelar o seu casamento, voltou a caminhar até o altar, desta vez sem câmaras e sem passadeira vermelha. Apenas o vento no céu e o aroma das flores silvestres enchiam o ar no seu pequeno rancho no Novo México. Nenhum jornalista foi convidado. Even some close friends only learned afterward. Julia wore a simple dress. No crown, no choir, just whispered I do into the stillness. She was no longer America's sweetheart. She was a woman who had finally found her true home. With Daniel, Julia discovered what fame could never give her steadiness. When the whole world looks at me as a star, he sees me as a person, she once said. And from that simplicity, she was reborn. Together, they built a life not dazzling, but enduring. In 2004, Julia welcomed twins Hazel and Phineas, followed by baby Henry in 2007. Amid children's laughter and the golden light of sunrise on her porch, Julia said, "The title I'm most proud of isn't actress. It's mother." At their Taos ranch, her life was no longer measured in box office numbers or magazine covers, but in warm breakfasts, sunlit afternoons, stretching across the yard, and peaceful evenings with her family. Daniel Malta, the man who once stood behind the camera, became her steady anchor, the one who turned her old wounds into calm. And so, Julia Roberts' greatest role was not Vivian Ward or Erin Brockovich. It had no script, no director. That role was called real life. Wife, mother, partner. The woman who once stood beneath the world's brightest lights, wounded by broken dreams, had now found happiness in quiet simplicity. The world had given her the crown of fame, but she chose instead the gentle light of home. And in that light, Julia Roberts finally understood what Hollywood, for all its glory, could never teach her. That sometimes the greatest victory in life is learning how to live in peace. In 2014, when her half-sister passed away, Julia carried within her a sorrow so deep that no words could reach it. There were no headlines, no noise, only a quiet shadow carved deep into her soul. Friends said she rarely spoke of it, choosing to keep it private, as if to protect both the memory of the one who was gone and her own fragile peace. But at night, when the ranch was still and her children fast asleep, that loss would return and sit quietly at the edge of the light like a shadow that refused to leave. It was a reminder that even the brightest smile can tremble, and that even a life filled with love cannot escape separation, that the heart endures not by avoiding pain, but by learning to hold both joy and sorrow at once. Between her and her brother actor, Eric Roberts, there had once been a long, aching distance, since the mid-1990 CE. When she soared to stardom after Pretty Woman, Eric had been battling his own demons, addiction, legal troubles, and the bitter comparisons the press never stopped drawing. Pride and misunderstanding hardened into silence. The siblings went their separate ways, each building a life that seemed to have no room for the other. But life in its quiet mercy offered them a bridge. Em 2004, quando Julia foi mãe, Eric segurou os seus gêmeos recém-nascidos pela primeira vez e algo dentro de si enterneceu-se. Olhando para aqueles pequenos e inocentes rostos, anos de ressentimento começaram a dissipar-se. O passado não desapareceu, mas a barreira entre eles rachou. A fissura transformou-se em cicatriz. E na cavidade dessa cicatriz, a ligação familiar regressou. Julia percebeu que curar não significa que a dor desapareceu, mas sim aprender a carregá-la com serenidade. Se Hollywood um dia tentou definir Julia pelas passadeiras vermelhas e pelos números de bilheteira, são estes momentos de reconciliação e recordação que realmente definem a sua humanidade. A estrela admirada pelo mundo ainda brilha, mas a sua luz tornou-se mais suave. Agora iluminada não só pela fama, mas pelo amor, pelo perdão e pela coragem silenciosa de seguir em frente, apesar dos vazios que o coração nunca poderá preencher. Aos 57 anos, Julia Roberts já não vive apenas como uma estrela, mas como uma mulher que enfrentou tempestades, carrega as suas cicatrizes com orgulho e encontrou um lugar de paz para brilhar silenciosamente, de forma constante, talvez mais profundamente do que nunca. Ela não corre mais de um set de filmagens para outro para provar que pertence àquele meio. A sua carreira é agora uma dança deliberada, menos, porém preciosa, não uma retirada, mas um triunfo. Cada papel que ela assume é um espelho, refletindo uma verdade interior e, num sentido mais lato, a verdade de todos nós. Em agosto, Condado de Osage, a imagem de uma filha a sucumbir ao peso de uma família desfeita não era apenas representação, era a memória apurada em arte. A nomeação para os Oscars foi um reconhecimento, mas o verdadeiro poder residia no que o público via refletido nos seus olhos. Não está sozinho. Come Homecoming entrou para a televisão não para mudar de rumo, mas para declarar que a sua arte nunca poderia ser confinada a um único meio. A Ticket to Paradise lembrou o mundo que a alegria nunca é superficial. O riso é também uma forma de força. Leave the World Behind mostrou que ela era capaz de lidar com as angústias de uma era fragmentada. E enquanto ela olha para o futuro, para o que está para vir após a caçada, com lançamento previsto para 2025, é mais do que apenas mais um marco. É uma promessa de que a chama, embora mais calma agora, ainda arde intensamente. Para além dos ecrãs, Julia expandiu a sua influência como uma verdadeira contadora de histórias. Através da Red Arm Films, defende projetos em que acredita. E como embaixadora de longa data da Lancôme, representa mais do que uma marca. Ela personifica a beleza amadurecida pelo tempo, mesmo no mundo da alta joalharia. Não veste elegância, personifica-a, uma sofisticação discreta, uma beleza que sabe quando se deve calar. Ocupa uma rara intersecção entre o cinema, a moda e os negócios, não para se manter jovem, mas para provar que a reinvenção pode significar sustentabilidade, evoluir sem perder a essência. The whispers about her health that have surfaced over the years were never confirmed nor denied. She lets her life speak for her. Instead, the steady rhythm of yoga palettes and swimming, long walks along the beaches of Malibu or the fields near Taos, a disciplined, balanced diet, sunscreen. Sunscreen as a daily ritual. It isn't performance, it's the quiet pulse of someone who has learned to protect her peace after years of chaos. She guards her privacy, fiercely showing the world her work, but not her wounds, her smile, but not her scars. And it is precisely that privacy that shapes the sanctuary she now protects, where children's laughter mingles with the scent of sunlit kitchens, where a single lamp warms the whole room, and where a woman, at last, has learned how to stay with herself. The media estimates Julia Roberts' net worth at around $250 to $300 million. But for her, that number has never defined the essence of wealth. Her language is the language of paradises, the Point Dume home in Malibu, where her children grew up under the same sunlight that once illuminated their mother's red carpets. The Taos Ranch, where she and Daniel Motter exchanged vows, still standing as a symbol of love and serenity. San Francisco was only a brief chapter. Hawaii, a closed memory. Each property is a story, not a trophy, but a refuge for laughter, breath, and safety. Most of her assets are placed in trusts, not to conceal, but to protect her family's peace in a world that's endlessly curious. Yet even within that cocoon of stability, darkness still lingers. At 57, Julia still carries the wounds of time, the silence of losing her father too young, the fractures of childhood that taught her both fragility and strength, the passing of her half-sister leaving a wordless void, and even smaller losses like burying the family dog, a piece of her children's early memories in the garden. For her, no amount of fortune can shield the heart from loss. Pain can only be softened by love. Julia has never measured wealth in money. To her, it lives in the morning coffee on the porch, in dinners where no one is a star, only family. In the sound of Hazel Phineas and Henry's laughter, a music she treasures more than any title. To the world, she remains a movie icon. To herself, she has finally found home. And though she fiercely guards her privacy, she has never closed her heart to the world. She speaks out for the environment, education, and gender equality. She donates quietly when disasters strike, never seeking the spotlight, only meaning, as she once said, "I wasn't given a star to promote myself, but to honor the world." On Finding Your Roots, when she discovered distant ties to the Mitchell family line, she smiled not because of status, but because she understood a name or bloodline is just a fragment. O que me define é o amor que semeio todos os dias. O legado de Julia vai, portanto, muito além dos ecrãs. Profissionalmente, foi a primeira mulher a ganhar $20 milhões por um único papel, um marco que mudou a conversa sobre igualdade em Hollywood. Mas a sua maior vitória não veio dos contratos, veio da emoção. O sorriso que outrora foi alvo de troça na infância tornou-se um símbolo global, um lembrete de que a verdadeira beleza não reside na perfeição, mas na força refinada pela bondade. Hoje, Julia vive maioritariamente em Malibu com Daniel e os seus 3 filhos. Os filhos já são adultos, mas ela ainda os protege de uma atenção intrusiva. Ela continua a voltar para Taos sempre que o seu coração precisa de paz. Ela ainda pisa a passadeira vermelha quando há uma história que vale a pena contar. Mas a bússola da sua vida mudou. "A minha vida é minha", disse ela uma vez. Uma declaração simples, mas silenciosa, que representou uma revolução na autoconfiança. A menina que antes caminhava penosamente pela neve com os sapatos rasgados anda agora descalça na relva. A jovem que um dia penhorou o relógio do pai para sobreviver, vê agora o tempo como um companheiro. Já não corre contra ele, mas caminha com ele, sem pressa e orgulhosa. A mulher que um dia temeu nunca ter um lugar a que pertencer, construiu um lar que nada pode abalar. A história de Julia Roberts não se resume aos filmes que recordamos, mas à vitalidade que aprendemos com ela. Que um começo difícil ainda pode levar à paz. Que até a pessoa mais amada do mundo pode cair e ainda assim reerguer-se com suavidade, mas com firmeza. O seu legado não se resume aos seus papéis, mas à prova de que a dor se pode transformar em luz. E essa luz, através do sorriso eterno de Julia Roberts, ainda brilha silenciosamente em cada coração. Uma chama suave que jamais se apagará.